Everything in the inner world affects the inner world. Everything in the inner world affects the outer world. Everything in the outer world affects the outer world. Everything in the outer world affects the inner world. So let's look at those in a little bit more detail. So what's in the inner world? What do we think of? Because it is an artificial partition. We think of thoughts being in the inner world. However, every single thought that we think changes our physiology and our emotional state. You know, close your eyes, think of a lemon. Think of eating a lemon. The thought changes the physiology. Now, something like that we can notice, and many subtler thoughts or thoughts that we're only partially present to have, very minimal impact. But with fine enough awareness, fine enough instrumentation, thinking the color red, thinking the color blue, we can measure that in the body. Just visualizing a color, or thinking, I'm going to go eat some ice cream, or I'm going to go meditate. There are physiological changes. Now, if we think that memory is in some way held within the body, right, then there is also a memory that is created that records the thoughts and the feelings that we have. And any thought that we have changes the memory of our thoughts, right? As if I imagine blue, and then you say, well, what were you just imagining? I have to now go into memory. So it has to be recorded somewhere. Now, the other thing is that all thoughts change feelings. Now, again, we can see it easily in extreme cases where we think the rest of my life is going to be amazing, where we think and believe that thought. Our feelings shift. And if we think and believe the thought, the rest of my life is going to be miserable, we can again instantly experience the emotional impact of that thought. And we also can say that every feeling that we have changes our physiology. We could say that the thought organizes patterns of energy to produce a chemical output called a feeling of sadness or a feeling of joy. Or we could say that the feeling of joy produces different chemicals in the body than the feeling of sadness, right? But we can definitely say that there's influence, right? And we see it going both ways, because if I imagine you having just an incredible life, maybe I feel jealous, right? So if I imagine me having an incredible life, I feel the peace and the joy of that, my body feels different, right? So that's thoughts changing feelings, changing the body. Now, on the other hand, you can try this one too. So let's do it with this. I'm feeling incredibly happy. And this is the physiology of smiling that changes the body. And once the body is opening up into a more pleasurable state, correlated with smiling and laughing, the joyful feeling comes in. And with the body feeling in a good state and the joyful feelings being present, what comes in to correlate are more positive thoughts. Meaning, while you're doing this and feeling this, you're not predisposed to think, when's the good time to kill myself, right? It's incongruous, right? What you're predisposed to think is, life is good, this is great, right? And so the thought catches up with the sensation and the feeling, right? So what we call inner, first of all, bleeds into the outer, because all thoughts and all feelings affect the body. Now, our identity consists of our thoughts, our feelings, our words, what we say, right? Now, we can say this, right? If I say I'm having a great day, my body, my thoughts, my feelings are different than when I say I'm having a bad day. They're definitely different, right? And whether they're positively different, meaning more expansively different or more contractually different, depends on, in part, the story we tell about those words. If we believe, meaning to enter the narrative of our words, I'm having a great day, if we believe that, then we feel better. But if we don't believe it, and instead believe that nobody wants to truly know what I'm feeling, so I have to lie and pretend to make other people comfortable because they don't actually want to know the truth of my misery, then saying I'm having a great day, correlated with that story, may produce bitterness and the sensations of bitterness, that nobody really cares, which produces this sensation in the body. Nobody really cares. They don't really want to know how I'm feeling. I have to pretend that I'm having a great day because nobody cares, and they're going to punish me if I say that I feel absolutely miserable and hopeless. And that's why I feel miserable and hopeless, because nobody cares. They just want to hear that I'm fine so that they can ignore me because I'm not important. See this? If I believe those words, I don't want to move, I don't want to look, right? And so that's how the inner moves into the outer, right? Because the outer world treats me differently when I'm like that. Now, a more empathic segment of the outer world would say, oh, you look very sad. You don't look like you're having a great day. Right? And that is a different response. Now, the more sociopathic elements in the outer world, right? Because the outer world is a series of complex patterns of energy, some of which we name as empathic and some of which we name as sociopathic. The more sociopathic elements, that's dissociative. Judgment, superiority, inferiority, cruelty, hatred, right? Or that has nothing to do with me. There's a higher tendency to judge, to have more judgment. So there might be, oh, what a loser, or, clearly doesn't value themselves enough to even tell the truth. They're clearly miserable and, dissociate, right? But the way we hold ourselves and what we do out of our beliefs changes the way that other people respond to us. It also changes the things that we do and the things that we don't do, the choices we make. Emerge out of the state that we are in, and the state that we're in emerges out of the thoughts that we believe, the feelings those produce, and the physiology that that produces. So the inner world changes the outer world. And the outer world changes the inner world, right? If we're going along in our outer world and we see a crowd of people beating up a child and nobody helping, wait a minute, am I in a reptilian environment? Is human nature basically cruel? Like, how do we make sense of that? To see a crowd of people that we thought were human beings using superior mass to beat up a child, and no one's protecting the child. It suggests that we're in a reptilian environment, that these people are not in a human state, because human beings have empathy. And the empathy would be for the child, the smaller one. But that's not being expressed, suggesting that the predominant state is reptilian. So as we digest the fact that we are surrounded by reptiles in human body, that's a different thought. It produces a different feeling. It produces a different physiological state. And it leads to different choices. So the outer world changes the inner world. And that's an extreme example. Similarly, if we witness a group of people giving out $100 bills, offering blessing, dancing, we might have a thought like, the future is bright. I'm surrounded by beautiful human beings, transcendent beings who are giving of themselves from a state of abundance. The future is bright. I'm surrounded by human beings. And the physiology, and as we believe that thought and make different choices out of that thought, then our whole inner world is, again, affected. And again, that's another extreme. But those two extremes point to the fact that while we can only focus on a few things at a given moment, and so the physiological impact of seeing a tree versus not seeing a tree is very tiny. Well, obviously our memory has changed. Everything that we see or don't see affects our memory. And we do have a physiological reaction to every sensory perception. An opening, a closing, an aversion, an engagement. We have a physiological reaction with everything we sensorily perceive. And that physiological reaction affects our thoughts and feelings. Every event in our lives affects our thoughts and our feelings and our physiology. And every thought that we think affects our feelings and our physiology and influences our choices and impacts our outer world. So this is a relay between the small one and the ecology. Now, it is obviously an illusion created by language to see the individual, a word, as separate from the species. It's an illusion created by language. Without the species, there's no individual. Without the individuals, there's no species. That's a pretty close relationship. It's called a dependent relationship, right? We can say that I have these lungs and they have nothing to do with the body. But if the body dies without the lungs and the lungs die without the body, it's a pretty close relationship, right? No, never met him before, right? You can say that with your parents or your family, whatever. Yeah, we're distant, right? Yeah, whatever. I never think about them, never met them. They're not important. They're just the source of my entire life, right? I don't exist without my ancestors, right? Do my ancestors exist without me? Right? There's a better case to be made for that my ancestors exist without me than that I exist without my ancestors. But certainly ancestors don't exist because ancestors are that which came before. What? Me, right? So the word ancestor is based on the present looking back. If there is no present, there's no looking back, right? So you don't get an ancestor, you get something, but not an ancestor, right? You need something present now to look back for there to be a looking back to the last generation. They are the last generation if there's no future generation, right? And so they're not an ancestor, they're the last generation. So everything inside affects the outer world. Everything in the outer world affects the inner world to varying degrees. And there are no real partitions between the inner and the outer, between the individual and the species, between the species and the planet, between the planet and the universe, between the heart, the mind, and the body. Meaning you cannot have a physiological sensation that does not have influence on our thoughts and feelings. You cannot have a thought or a feeling that doesn't have influence on our body. You cannot have thoughts, feelings, and body sensations without influencing what is said and what is done and the way of showing up. If I walk up to you and I look at you and then I look down, and you're a human being, that means you pick up, right? You're trying through mirror neurons, through empathy, you're trying to understand what it's like to be me. That's what human beings do. Reptiles do it as well, right? They're trying to understand the pattern so that they can manipulate it. Human beings are trying to understand the pattern so they can empathize, so they can attune, so they can collaborate. So if I look at you and look like that, and I'm scared of you, and you look at, well, what does that mean? Well, it kind of looks like he's scared of me. Well, then your mind, which wants to know what's going on, your pattern analyzing mind is going to say, what is so scary about me that someone is afraid of me like that? And the deeper you go into my state, as I'm that way, the more you start to see yourself as someone frightening, because that's how I'm seeing you. I'm seeing you as somehow frightening. You're going to hit me. You're going to hurt me. You're not going to help me. You're going to humiliate me. Those are consistent with this posture, right? And if you look at yourself through your state and say, hello there, welcome, I'm not going to hurt you. And you stay in your state. But if I respond even more, like, don't get anywhere near me, right? Right? Maybe you feel confused. Maybe you get angry. Well, I said I'm not going to hurt you. Oh, don't go, right? Hey, right? So you could fall into my dream where you start to get angry, confused, wonder what's wrong with you, right? Because there's something very frightening about you. I'm seeing you as someone who could hurt me. And you're seeing yourself as a warm person. But if you reach out and say, hey, welcome, and I respond with more fear, then if you go into my world, you have to start seeing yourself and your warmth as somehow threatening. You have to start asking, why is it threatening? Well, maybe I could use and abuse, and you fall into my dream. Or I move into your state, right? So states are viral. Human States, This Emotional Life, a PBS series, explores the fact that proximity to a human state predicts the probability of experiencing that same state. If you're around 5 people who are incredibly unhappy and depressed, the probability that you will feel depressed is significantly higher than if you're around someone with, or 5 people with a joyful state, because states are viral, right? So the emotional physiological state that I'm in is viral. And the emotional state and physiological state that you're in is viral. And so the question is, these viruses meet. These patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, as they meet, will one change to the, will I change to you? Will you change to me? Or will we compromise and meet in the middle? Either way, there's impact, right? And usually it's not black and white. Usually I'll change you in some ways, you'll change me in some ways. Maybe I'll change you more than you change me. It depends how susceptible you are to various viruses. But if you're in a depressing world, where the news says that nothing seems to be working out, where your parents say it's hopeless, where the people around you are giving up, and when you try to do something, you fail, and everyone says it's pointless, right? That's an environment that's predisposed to hopelessness. Versus your parents are succeeding, the news is talking about things succeeding, your government is talking about a bright future, the people around you are achieving goals, and you do something and maybe it didn't work out the first time, but people say, that's normal. Do it again. Try it a few more times and it'll work out sometime the next 10 times, right? You're doing a good job, just fiddle with those things and it'll work out soon enough, right? The virus of hopefulness. You're predisposed in such an ecology to feel more hopeful. Now, what this is suggesting is that the inner world is a fractal representation, a fractal mirror of the outer world. And the outer world is generated, is created, and thus a fractal representation of the inner world. That my life is a reflection of what I think and what I feel and what I believe, what I imagine, what I choose out of those beliefs. My life is a reflection of that. And what I think, what I feel, what I imagine, what I choose to believe is a reflection of my outer world. When I saw my little brother get raped, when I saw my mom sell my sister for drugs, when I saw how Daddy hit me, I believed that I was inadequate. And I felt horrible and unlovable. And I thought my life is going to be terrible. And I felt absolutely terrible. And believing that, remembering that memory, those memories, seeing those thoughts, and imagining the terrible life, I didn't apply to college, right? I didn't pursue my goals. I didn't think it was possible, right? So the environment, the memory, the experience comes in, and I'm a reflection of that. And the many individuals, including me, co-create that environment. So there's a relay of energy. And it all starts out because we all begin the world with innocence. And innocence is the state of sympathy, where we unconditionally internalize and accept the code of the cult, the code of the family. And then, if we're fortunate enough, if we are loved enough as children, we move into adolescence, which is antipathy. That's the questioning state. That's the critical state, where we dissociate from our parents, from our cult, from the system, and we critically analyze it. That's not so good. Dad, what you're doing here is dumb. Mom, that's not the best science, you know. School, you could do a lot better over here, right? We critically analyze. Antipathy, right? And it takes a certain amount of love, a certain amount of competence to afford to grasp the ignorance, the stupidity, and the cruelty in our environment, the imperfection. Because in order to think, we have to be able to put it into words. And profoundly unloving and incompetent environments cannot tolerate any criticism. If you're with a rageaholic that beats you, traumatizes you, shames you for the slightest bit of criticism, it may be too dangerous in that cult, in that environment, to go into antipathy, to go into adolescence, and really spell out everything that's wrong with all the many things around us. Because the more incompetent the cult is, the more incompetent the family is, the more they will exclude any data of criticism. Right? So it also takes a certain amount of love and self-love and independence and competence to be able to afford that. Right? If nobody will talk to us and nobody will give us any money, and if we're kicked out of the house at age 14 because we had the audacity to enter the adolescent state of antipathy and actually point out some of the hypocrisy, lies, incompetence, and stupidity that's going on around us, and we're in such an incompetent environment, we don't know how to take care of ourselves because there's no good role models. It can become too dangerous to grow up. So we stay in a childlike state where we just don't say anything. It's too dangerous to think. It's too dangerous to speak. And if we're in a relatively competent environment where those around us have the decency to say, you're right, I'm not a perfect parent. And you're right, the cult is pretty dumb in this area. And that is hypocritical what I did there. I did it out of expediency because I can, because I've got the legal authority and the money and you don't yet. And I'm just too tired, you know, and I don't have the competency to find a better job where I wouldn't be so tired. I'm just doing what I can, and no, it's not very good, and everything you're saying is correct. You may be exaggerating a little bit, you know, because you feel in a dependent, helpless relationship, but you're absolutely right. You know, the corruption in the government, stupidity at school. We're pretty dumb as parents in this area, in this area, in this area. We know a little bit here and here, right? And, you know, it's not going to change that much until you become an adult and figure it out for yourself. And you're going to have to try and do better than we can. with relatively poor role models. You know, that's a pretty high level of competency for a parent to actually speak openly to their adolescent about, this. And that can help move into synthesis, where you're not asked to go insane by the dysfunction of your parent, because a narcissist, a cruel parent, will ask you as the child to go insane so that they don't have to feel shame in a shame-based cult, in a shame-based psychology, where everything they do wrong is because they're bad and deserve to be punished. That's a shame-based cult. And if your parents were raised by shame-based parents that punished every mistake rather than learning from it, then everything that they acknowledge as valid criticism would be a basis for self-punishment and self-shame and humiliation. And most people in power will not willingly inflict that on themselves. Instead, what they'll do is, in essence, say, I don't want to have to punish myself. That's the thing I've learned to do if I'm making mistakes, and I don't want to do it. So what I'd like to do is ask you to go crazy and pretend that all of the data that you've gathered and witnessed is flawed, that you're untrustworthy. So I'm not going to punish myself. I'm going to punish you for bringing up untrustworthy data, right? And so here you have the sociopathic inversion, where I'm going to punish you for bringing up the truths that show my incompetence, right? So an adolescent may not want to tell the truth, etc., and may just fume or go back into a childlike state and say, I must be crazy, right? So the last state, of course, the adult state, is synthesis and self-love and maturity, taking the best of what was given to us, rejecting the worst of what was given to us, and creating and iterating and innovating something new, something original, letting life, evolution flow through us and transcending the family system. So let's look at this as kind of in a couple of practical ways. Everything within shows up somewhere in the outside, and everything outside shows up somewhere inside. And the boundary between the inside and the outside is an illusion created by language, right? You can't think a thought without it stimulating a feeling, without it changing your physiology, without it changing your behavior, without it changing the outer environment. So they are one and the same. You cannot have one without the other. You cannot have an event happening out there that has zero impact in here. In other words, before there were words to divide the one into two, to divide the two into many, we're dealing with an interconnected ecology. So if we look at us as the individual, right, the first thing to understand is that the psyche is like a tree. And what I mean by that is the one-year-old psyche, we were all, every one of us, was once 1 year old, right? That's a certainty. We were all 1 year old, and when we were 1 year old, there were certain patterns of engaging with the world that facilitated, that supported us in meeting our human needs through other people. Meaning, for some of us, if we were silent, we were treated better. For some of us, if we screamed, we were treated better. For some of us, neither of those worked. Flailing around worked best. And for some, getting into danger worked best, right? There was a pattern that generated an optimal response statistically in our environment. And that pattern, that outer ecology, it was internalized in an identity. At 1 year old, there weren't thoughts yet because there wasn't language, right? But there's a physiological thing, watching the facial expressions and responding to that. And so there's an identity, a pattern. There's not yet an I, but there's a pattern that develops. And then at 2 years old, there are different things that work better, right? Some things that worked at 1 year old don't work as well at 2 year old. Something that didn't work at 1 year old because we couldn't do them, they work at 2 year old. So there's a new pattern at 2. And then there's a new pattern at 3. And a new pattern at 4, right? And we keep developing, we keep having experiences, and we keep learning how to facilitate well-being within the context of our environment. We keep developing new patterns. We keep learning. Every year, we find ourselves in a slightly different outer ecology. We have more experience, more iterations, more data points, and we keep learning. And as we learn, we adjust our identity. That's the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that we attach to, that the I says, that's me. That's my pattern. I think this. I feel this. Now, let's say at age 3 that the very best pattern was to cry, and that the thought that produced the tears was the thought, I'm unlovable. So we kind of wave, we try and connect with mom, we need some milk. It's not paying attention. We feel unlovable because we need the milk. We feel unlovable, we cry, and then mom comes and delivers the milk. So that's the pattern. I need something, and I feel unlovable, and I cry. And then the milk is delivered. Well, by about age 8, maybe that's not working anymore. For a boy, maybe we're being shamed for crying. Danny is a crybaby, Danny is a crybaby, and no milk is coming. We're crying, no milk is coming. So there's a new iterative behavior, right? So we see that there's contempt for crying, for having feelings. So maybe we adopt a superiority towards our own feelings and towards anyone else feeling. And we identify with those who feel superior. And now we have a bonding of shared superiority. And so now we've got this pattern. So we've still got the 3-year-old that wants to cry and who gets milk. But now we look down at that 3-year-old as an 8-year-old. And we look down at our younger siblings. And we join in the teasing of anyone who bursts into tears. And we humiliate them and humiliate them. And what we're saying is, I'm not one of those people. I'm this type of person, right? I'm bigger, I'm tough, right? So that seems to work, right? Because now Dad wants us in the garage, hand me that wrench, son. It seems to be working, right? We're superior, And so that identity, that pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being is working. But it's not working in this other environment, right? Let's say we want to date, we're 15, and making fun of our girlfriends or possible girlfriends' feelings, it's just not working very well. So we learn to talk more or listen more. And then the relationship works, right? And we experience more love and belonging. And so we have a new identity, a new pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. Now, certainly within memory, all of these patterns are stored. That means within the body, all these patterns are stored. And they may be largely disintegrated, meaning there may be a dissociative 3-year-old who doesn't trust the older parts because they were humiliated, who was holding on to screaming as the best way to respond. And there may be a contemptuous 8-year-old who's trying to feel superior with dad, trying to be a clone, etc., and is getting perks for doing that. There may be a confused and kind of somewhat clumsy 15-year-old trying to talk about feelings or not be so contemptuous of a lover, and everything in between, right? But these are regions within the psyche. The psyche is built up like a tree, layer by layer by layer. And the question is, how strong is this tree? How strong is the identity? How strong is the pattern? Well, part of it is how schizophrenic is the pattern. If you're given everything you want for screaming at age 2, and then you're hit for screaming at age 4, that's a schizophrenic pattern. Because the 4-year-old is saying, whatever you do, don't scream, because they don't want to be hit. And the 2-year-old is saying, whatever you need, scream, because then you get what you need, right? So you've got schizophrenia. Right? So if the developmental process is a schizophrenic one, where this was great here but not here, or worse still, if you split the identity further, you may have an addict for a parent, and when they're high on whatever it is they're addicted to, then they behave this way, and when they're sober, they behave this way. And so you've not only got the schizophrenia of time, you've now got the schizophrenia of substance. So what works like, hey, can I have some pocket money for going down to the theater? That works when they're high, but it gets a shaming remark and a hit when they're sober, or vice versa, right? So now you've got a bifurcation of the identity based on the giant, the parent. And different parts of you then, being split that way. One part may say, I am lovable. I am unlovable. That would be the child, right? The child is always internalizing the external and making it all about themselves. The adolescent may externalize it again and say they are decent parents when they're sober. They're son of a bitches when they're not. It's no longer I'm lovable, I'm not lovable. They're decent, they're crappy. And they're overall crappy because they go back and forth between being decent and crappy, and I have to constantly figure out what they are today, right? So we have all of these identities, all of these patterns of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that we believe in, that we invest energy in at different ages, at different times. And they're all in the body. They're in the memory. They're in the field. And as we regress in traumatic events, for example, we become the 3-year-old, we become the 5-year-old. Right? When you're traumatically triggered, you're no longer dealing with reality as a 40-year-old. You're dealing with the same situation, but you feel as if you're 3 years old, and you're looking with very small eyes at that big world, and it feels very overwhelming, because it is very overwhelming to a 3-year-old. Right? It's too much to deal with. A 3-year-old shouldn't have to deal with your life. But when you're regressed, your inner 3-year-old has to deal with your life because there's no adult present, because there wasn't an adult present when you were 3 years old and traumatized to protect you from the trauma. So this is the complexity of the psyche, of the body, of the self, of the ego. Right? Remember when you were 3 years old? Yes, I felt this. I thought this. That pattern is still in there. Now, every single one of those patterns has impact on the outer world. Just like every ring of a tree has influence on the tree today, right? If in the younger years, if you look at a tree growing, starts out symmetrical, next year symmetrical, but in the third year, something odd happened in the tree and it bent heavily over this way. Now, every other subsequent ring of growth grows around the anomaly, the asymmetrical shape. If there's rot that occurs in year 3 of snapped branch or something, the remaining trees, they grow over that rot. And that rot continues to eat out the inside. The inside of the tree may die, and there's just a very thin outer level. And what that means is that a hollow tree is more vulnerable to collapse, just like a hollow adult, a hollow grown-up, right? Someone with a traumatized, confused, schizophrenic inner child and adolescent is much more vulnerable to collapse their grown-up self than someone with a very strong inner core, i.e. the infancy, the childhood, the adolescence, have a strong integrated form. It's tough wood, and it supports the self that's here today. So this is how we have schizophrenia, we have contradiction, we have hypocrisy, right? How is it that we say life is good and then life sucks? I mean, those are two very different things, right? We're not being scientific here. We're not saying sometimes life is good and sometimes life sucks. We're saying life is great. And then on another day, we're saying, my whole life sucks, right? So which is it, right? And of course, when you say and believe life is great, your physiology, your behavior is moving with that. But usually the pivots between those 2 points have something to do with the outer environment. Usually there's something that happens in the outer environment, and we feel frustrated and all of that. Then we say life sucks. And then something else at some point happens, and we say, oh, life is great, right? That's how the outer comes to the inner, right? But let's say that your 4-year-old feels completely unlovable. And believes that feeling, that thought, I am unlovable. Well, as you navigate your life and move through the cycle of life, there will be moments in your life when you feel 4 years old. And in those moments, you will feel unlovable, unworthy. And if you want to stay sane, you will often sabotage the loving things in your life so that you feel more sane. Because it feels very disconcerting to say that I'm completely unlovable and I'm totally loved. But to say that I feel completely unlovable and nobody loves me, that feels sane, right? It feels, I know how to, that makes sense. I'm unlovable and I'm not loved. It makes sense, but I'm unlovable and I'm deeply loved. What do I do with that, right? If I don't know how to integrate and let that 4-year-old shift belief, I may know how to sabotage and push away the people I love so that their not there anymore. Now, we live in a mixed cult, a mixed culture. What do I mean? Well, there's 4 brains operating. There's the reptilian brain, which is all about exploitation, fear, pain, scarcity, incompetence. The big attack and exploit the small. The old exploit the young. That's sociopathic, reptilian. And that operating system is still present. 10, 20, 30, 40% of the time in the human species and in the natural world. Right? You know, piranha doesn't say, "Oh, you're having a bad day. I'll eat you tomorrow when you're feeling better. Bye." No, if you're depressed and laying there in the water, the piranha says, "Oh, good. This is a great opportunity to save energy. I won't have to hunt you because you're too depressed to swim away. So I'll just eat you now," right? So that's reptilian. That's sociopathic, right? A sociopath tries to steal money from an old lady because it's easier than stealing it from a young man, right? In the stereotype, right? So, you know, that's, whereas a human being says, "Oh, let's protect the elderly. Let's protect our women and children." That's human, that's empathic. And there is an empathic brain. But people segue based on how much pain they're in, based on how much fear of pain they're in, between the reptilian brain and the empathic or transcendent brain. And then we have the rational brain that has rational thoughts that are often induced by the cult or culture. And if the cult is about individuals, it will say, "That's not my problem. That's a meme given to you by your cult." Another cult will say, "It's our issue. We're a circle. We all need to help each other." But that's an empathic cult message. A sociopathic cult message, an individualistic cult message is, "That's not my problem. Take care of number one. You know, do the best you can and don't worry about anyone else." If those are the memes that you're given and you're in a childlike state, then you believe those. And so your rational brain will tend towards more sociopathic, dissociative behavior. The empathic state, how can I help? Who's in the most pain? How can we help? Those are the 2 questions of the empathic brain. Who is in the most pain? How can we help? If those are the primary questions being asked by the people around you or that you are asking, you are primarily in the empathic brain. There's a very small percentage of people who are primarily in the empathic brain because it's perfectly straightforward. Who's in the most pain? How can we help? And that flows naturally out of empathy, right? Because empathy is about sensing what's going on, and the most logical thing to do in an empathic culture is to look at the greatest pockets of suffering and do something about them as if they were our own. That's what empathy is, acknowledging the innate rapport between all things. The sociopathic protocol is, "Yeah, that's your problem. I have nothing to do with you." That's why it's dissociative. That's why it's sociopathic. Empathic is, of course, your problem is our problem. How can we help, right? That's empathic. So we have different cult operating systems present in different environments that correlate to different brains, different levels of brain development. The reptilian brain is the primary original brain. Then comes the rational sociopath, the rational and reptilian partnership, to become incredibly competent at sociopathic, dissociative, exploitive behavior for personal gain at the expense of others. And then comes empathic, And then the competency to be incredibly competent at empathy, to have the most benefit with the least amount of effort, to do the most for others out of empathy. Then the transcendent brain, to truly connect to the innate unity of all things, to transcend the I, the ego, to a point where we celebrate all of life, the beauty of being a very small part of life, and the joy of letting go when life is done, returning the energy to the pattern where it can continue to iterate and develop. So people are constantly moving between those four brains. Sometimes they are reptilian, sometimes they're empathic, sometimes they're transcendent, sometimes they're irrationally sociopathic, and sometimes they're rationally sociopathic. Sometimes they're irrationally empathic, and sometimes they're rationally empathic. Sometimes they're rationally transcendent, right, to the degree that that's possible. So that schizophrenia, or that bifurcation of different operating systems, is internalized. And the messages within those operating systems is also internalized, right? When a parent uses their child to disperse their pain, shame, and rage, because they can, that's a sociopathic message. That's saying you're used to me is to get rid of my bad feeling at your expense. That's you're only used to me. And so the human part of the other person will say, I'm useless. I have no value other than to be used by my parent. And that's true. That's your only value to the reptilian brain in your parent. But then at other times when your parents are feeling better about themselves or things are going well, then they're very empathic and love you for yourself. And in that time you say, well, I do have some value, right? But often there's a bias negative. If you go up, I have value, I have no value, I have value, I have no value. By the time you get to a teenage year, you often say, I have no value and I don't care. I'm not going to believe when you treat me well, because I don't want to be jerked around by you. You jerk. What does that mean? You're pulling me into empathy, and then you're pulling me into reptilian and into empathy. You're jerking me around. All parents jerk their children around, because all children are in reaction to their parent without choice. So when the parent is angry, the child is in a reaction to that, right? So we have four operating systems. Then we have different strategies in the age, throughout the age. We have different cultural experiences. And we have different levels of schizophrenia within the culture, right? You have sociopaths going around saying, oh, isn't it wonderful? I love everything and do this, right? Because they've gotten the message that that's the thing to say, and that being sociopathic is the thing to do. And so there's a bifurcation between what they're doing and what they're saying. Right? So, but what if they reward a child for not pointing out that discrepancy? What if you're dealing with a sociopath who's talking about how much they love the world and everyone in it? And they're dealing with a sociopath who will punish the child less if the child doesn't point out the hypocrisy, the gap, blow the cover, right, of the narrative. Well, now the child may go insane and reclassify all the abuse as love, right? But then they may not want to be loved given all the abuse they experienced under that word. So now they've gone insane. They don't want to be loved. Get away from me. Don't love me. Because love has been classified as abuse. So that is just kind of highlighting some of the complexity of the patterns that are within each one of our bodies, each one of our minds, each one of our psyches. And here's the thing, right? Within all of us, let's say there is 25% of us that says, I am not loved. I'm unlovable. And then there's another 25% that says, I'm great, I'm happy, I'm cool. And so this part, I'm unlovable. This part up here, varying expressions of I am lovable, right? So everything in the inner world reflects the outer world, affects the outer world, and is reflected in the outer world in some way. And everything in the outer world is reflected in the inner world in some way. So out here is our reality. Now, 25% of our reality must reflect I am unlovable. If 25% of the inner reality, now how could that be? That could be 25% of us believes today that we're unlovable, and 75% or 25% believes we're lovable, and the others are kind of on the fence. Or it could be that there's 25% of our past we felt completely unlovable, but 75% of our past we feel lovable, and they haven't really reconciled, they haven't integrated, they're in dissociative states produced by trauma that has not been integrated in a traumatically illiterate cult. So I am unlovable, says 25% of me. Now, another part says, no, you're not unlovable. Yes, I'm unlovable. No, you're not unlovable. You're cool. Look at this. Look at that. This is great. Look at, you won this award, right? And so they're both there. The unlovable part is not convinced by all of that, but they're both there, right? I'm lovable in this area, in this area, in this area, but I'm not lovable here, right? So if 25% of us believes we're unlovable, that belief will show up. We can go insane. That's one possibility, right? But then that shows up. 25% of us will reveal in our reality that we are unlovable and not loving ourselves, right? Because if we believe we're unlovable, we will not love ourselves in that domain. So how does that work? Like if I'm cool, I'm happy, I'm confident, I'm successful, that says 25% of me. And 25% of me is saying I'm unlovable, I'm never going to be loved, etc. How does that work? Well, the 25% has to show up in the outer world because there is ultimately no divide between the inner and outer world. But how it shows up in that 25% reflection could take a variety of ways. For example, if I'm cool, I'm successful, and I know the technique of, how to manifest a great life, I could manifest a great life and the 25% of unlovability shows up, but I don't enjoy it at all. I'm constantly waiting to be found out as an imposter, that I'm not really lovable, that I don't deserve this. And so I'm very successful on the outer level. I'm very unsuccessful on the inner level. Or I'm very successful at experiencing unlovability. So that could be it, right? I just don't follow through, right? Meaning I don't enjoy that wonderful life. Now this is something that, and one of the reasons this video is important to me to kind of explore and understand, is I've experienced that a lot. That the outer level, just through competency and technique, can be made amazing, right? Lots of money, lots of time, lots of sex, lots of whatever it is. But the more I push that, like the outer level reflects complete lovability in terms of the form, etc. Then the inner unlovability comes stronger up as a feeling, right? To balance that out, to represent the other 25%. Or I can feel very lovable and have very little outer success. So the unlovability is I don't love myself enough to succeed on the outside, but I love myself enough to enjoy the little success that I have. Or I love myself enough to create a lot of outer success, but not enough to enjoy it. And so it's still reflected, right? And it's very much like compulsion, right? Because this is another thing. Like, if there are certain traumatic memories and thoughts that we don't want to be present for, let's say there's 25% of that. So 25% of my outer reality has to in some way be about reflecting the fact that I don't want to be present for something. Now, the thought, I don't want to feel that, I don't want to be present there, that's on the inner side. On the outer, this can be expressed in a variety of ways. I could get drunk 25% of the time and not be present. I could compulsively punish myself so that I'm not present for a certain memory 25% of the time. Or I could compulsively run late for things. But in some way, that 25% need to not be present for certain things will show up in the outer world. But how it shows up, that's the key thing. Like, everything in the inner world shows up in the outer world, and everything in the outer world shows up in the inner world. But how it shows up is incredibly unique and mutable, right? If I believe I'm unlovable, 25% of my psyche believes that. I can shift that to where I feel bad when I'm very successful. I can delete that, and I can be less successful and feel good. I can delete that and get sick and feel good and be successful, but be very sick. I can have a car accident that's not very loving, right? Because I'm not lovable, but otherwise be feeling good and not be sick and this. But now I'm in tremendous pain in the hospital because in some way that belief in the statement, I am unlovable, I don't deserve to be loved, has got to show up in some area. Now, in AA, for example, the compulsive need to smoke in order to mask certain feelings often transmutes into the compulsive need to eat. Or if I'm not eating, I'm smoking. Or if I'm not smoking and eating, I'm compulsively watching Netflix. Or if I'm not doing that, I'm compulsively gambling, right? I'm doing something that reflects that compulsive energy. And my choice is, if I don't change the inner world, my choice in the outer level is not to delete and have a totally loving life. My choice is to move the unlovability around. So I've got 25% unlovability. How do I want to express it today? Oh, today I'll get in a traffic accident. Tomorrow I'll lose my wallet. Next week I will I'll pick someone who will insult me and tell me how disgusting I am. But in some way in the life, I will look at it and 25% of my life will reflect that I'm unlovable. And the 20 or 30 or 40 or 50% of me that says I'm great and I'm neat, that will also be reflected in my life. 25, 30, 40, 50% of me will be saying, oh, you're growing here, you're great, you are lovable, and this is wonderful. And that will also be there. And I could do it here, like I could have a great relationship, or I could have wonderful success in business, or I could have just generally feeling absolutely great with no particular thing going on, right? I can do that in 50% of the outer reflection. But there is a loop between these two, right? And the loop is, having gotten a car accident, I say, see, I'm dumb, I'm not lovable. That reinforces the inner. And having reinforced the inner, I go and lose my wallet because now that the outer expression now honors and reflects the inner expression. So this is a loop between the chicken and the egg, the outer and the inner reality that are in fact one. And they generally, like most patterns, which the ego loves to hold on to because its need for control is primary in a somewhat sociopathic and in a traumatic and traumatically illiterate culture. Trauma is always shaking us up, making us feel chaotic and out of control. The ego wants to control things, and one of the easiest things to control are deep, painful memories. Right? It's not hard to hold on to. They're very heavy energy, and so the ego feels very safe in its identity, its pattern, if they're heavy energies, right? Painful energies. Right? I just think them over and over and over again. They don't go away, right? Joyful memories drift off, but painful memories, I just think about them, and I know who I am. I get certainty from that, which is one of the ego's needs. Now, the inner is going to continue to express the outer and reaffirm the inner and reaffirm the outer, right? I'm going to do something unloving, and then I'm going to tell myself I'm unlovable for doing that. And then because I'm unlovable, I'm going to do something that's not loving to myself. I'm going to eat, I might switch, right? Today I'm going to make a lot of money, I'm going to eat terribly. I'm going to make a lot of money and I'm going to think my worst thoughts so that I don't enjoy it, right? Or I'm going to think my best thoughts and I'm not going to make any money, right? So that can move around. And admittedly, it can be good to balance things out. And what I mean by that is if you cannot develop the competency to change your inner psyche, to interrupt this pattern, you might be better off balancing it out. What I mean by this is don't insist, like if you're if you're convinced 25% that you're unlovable, then understand that 25% of your life has to reflect that, some unlovability, and maybe divide it up nicely. I'll make enough money, but not much. I'll have reasonable health, but not much. I'll feel reasonably good, but not much. And I will have some highs and some lows. That would be to divide up that 25%, in each area of life. Otherwise, you could be highly successful and talented around money and absolutely miserable, right? That would balance it out, right? But you've got to find a place not to love yourself if you believe 25% that you're unlovable. If you have the thought, I deserve to be punished, to whatever extent you believe that thought, you've got to punish yourself in some way. You could win every lawsuit, but lose every relationship. You could always get the good parking space, but have bricks fall on your head. You're just always walking under construction sites and bricks fall on your head. But this, so you kind of have creative license on how the inner world is reflected in the outer world. And to some extent, you also have creative license as to how the outer world is reflected in the inner world. Right? You could be despair or rage or depression. You've got options on how you take the messages in the outer world and make sense of them in your inner world and that loop. Now, the importance of consciousness, of meditation, work with diary, of yoga, of therapy, the importance of meditation, of psychedelic meditation, psychedelic therapy, etc., is that it interrupts this cycle. because this happened, this, you deserve this, and because you deserve this, this needs to happen, right? That's a cycle. It's a cycle. It's going round. Consciousness is the only thing that can interrupt this cycle, that can transcend the cycle. Now, that's the transcendent brain, which is in low operation in materialistic cults, but it's present. The witness, the one that watches. I do this, then I do this, then I do this, then I do this, then I feel this, then I do this, then I feel this, then I do this, and I feel this, right? That's a loop. It's going round and round. Transcendence, evolution, is I interject something into the mix. I do something different. By witnessing, by the part of us that doesn't believe in the cycle, I let go of the charge that I have. I'm completely unlovable. I deserve to be punished. I'm completely unlovable. Maybe not. Let's be present to that. How do I know that that's true? Maybe it's not true. Maybe some part of me cannot love some part of me, but other parts of me can love those parts of me. Maybe that's true. Can I absolutely know, right, in Byron Katie's work, can I absolutely know that that's true? Well, the ego says, yes, it's true. It's me. I'm the one believing that, right? That's me. That's my identity. But is the ego real? Can we absolutely know that the ego is real? Right? Of course I'm real. I'm me. Right? How do we know, right? How can you be you separate from everything else if everything else affects you and you affect everything else? And you're in an interdependent ecology with everything else. Maybe you're not you. Maybe knowing that you're you and this and that isn't so important. Of course it's important, it's me, right? But the witness doesn't have to believe that message. The witness can say, okay, ego, you can believe that, but I'm going to be present. I'm going to be here. I'm going to interject a different behavior, a different pattern. I'm going to be open to a wider possibility field. I could think this, I could feel that, I could do this differently instead of that. I'm going to be open. I get that if you, I get all that. You believe that, ego. And that's who you are. Those beliefs, those thoughts, and you don't want to lose yourself. But I'm not you, ego. I'm watching you. I'm the witness. I transcend. And I'm still here. Regardless of this belief ending and that belief, the witness cannot be destroyed because the identity of the ego collapses. So the witness has more security. It's more fundamental. Every thought, every feeling, every belief, and every outer state will change, will die, and be replaced with something else. That's guaranteed. But the witness that witnesses the birth and the death, the birth and the death, will that die? Right? Certainly not as rapidly as the identity, as the pattern that is being held on to. Don't let it go, don't let go. I don't know who I will be, right? But the witness is who it is, regardless of what goes on with the ego.